A bank sent men to take a 71-year-old farmer's land in Oxfordshire. 3 generations had worked that soil, and by 11 o'clock that morning, the farm still belonged to the family. What stopped the takeover was not the bank, not the lawyer, and not the local men standing in the yard with their hands in their pockets. It was a stranger in a wax jacket and a battered Range Rover, a man nobody in that yard had placed at first. By the time people began to understand who he might be, the auction had already changed shape. Now, I should be clear about one thing before we go any further. The name used in the telling of this story, Harold Beckwith, is not a name I can point to in a parish record and call settled fact. It is the name the story has settled on over the years, a stand-in used so the family does not have to hear their real name repeated in every pub from here to Burford. That matters, because what follows sits in that awkward space between local memory and something closer to legend. But the setting, the pressure, and the feeling of it are all very real. This was 68 acres of stubborn Cotswold brash, the kind of hard, flinty ground that farmers near Chipping Norton know all too well. Barley grew there mostly. A few sheep too, though they were never really the business. They were there because sheep tend to linger on farms like that, even when the land's real value has always been in the arable ground. The family had worked it for decades. Harold's father had farmed it, and his father before him. In the version of the story people tell, there is a photograph that still hangs above the range in the farmhouse kitchen. 3 generations of Beckwith men squinting into the sun in front of the same gate that still stands there today, the paint peeling in exactly the same place it always has. It was never a grand estate, no lake, no portrait gallery, no polished rooms full of inherited confidence. Just a farmhouse with a crooked chimney that had needed repointing for years, a Dutch barn with a roof that had seen better decades, and land that had fed a family through 2 world wars, a great many bad harvests, and at least one summer so wet, the wheat gave up and lay flat in the mud. If you've ever seen a family farm that has outlived its own comfort, you know the look of it. It is not wealth in the obvious sense. It is endurance. It is repairs done late, debts carried quietly, and people making the same groundwork a little longer than anyone expected. But sentiment does not keep a farm alive. Machinery breaks. Fertilizer gets more expensive every spring. A bank manager in Oxford signs the papers that decide whether the family gets another season, even if he has never stood in a field at 5 in the morning with sleet hitting his face. That is the reality underneath the romance. Harold had borrowed against the farm in the 90s, the way many small farmers did, to buy a combine he genuinely needed and could not otherwise afford. He had paid it down ever since, a little at a time, harvest by harvest, the way his father had taught him to handle debt, not by pretending it would disappear, but by chipping away at it until it did. That was the plan. That was the discipline. And then the wheel stopped turning. 2 bad harvests hit back to back. A wet summer rotted half the barley before it could even be cut. His wife's illness drained the savings that remained, quietly and completely, the way illness often does. Not dramatically, just steadily, until there is less and less to argue with, and no easy way back. By spring, the letters were no longer polite. They stopped saying understand, and started saying require. By September, a date had been circled on a solicitor's calendar in Oxford. That date meant almost nothing to the solicitor, and everything to the family attached to it. By the first week of October, a printed notice had gone up outside the farm gate, cable tied to the same bars 3 generations of Beckwith men had leaned on. That is the kind of detail villagers remember, not because they enjoy it, but because they cannot help it. In a place where everyone's grandfather farmed everyone else's grandfather's neighboring field, a farm going under the hammer is not gossip. It is grief with a time printed on it. The morning of the auction, the lane up to the farm was full in a way it was never built for. Land Rovers, a few Volvo estates, people from 3 villages away, standing in solidarity and not bidding on anything, just being there. That matters in the countryside more than outsiders often realize. Sometimes presence is the only form of resistance left. Sometimes it is the only thing a community can offer when the paperwork is already moving and the outcome feels sealed. There was coffee on a trestle table by the barn, run by the vicar's wife, because in Oxfordshire, even a disaster tends to arrive with practical arrangements. There was shortbread nobody felt like eating. Harold stood by his back door wearing a jacket that had clearly been ironed for the occasion. That detail, more than any other, makes the scene sting. A man dresses properly when he is about to lose something he cannot replace. It is one of the last ways he can still control the morning. His daughter stood beside him, close enough to be there, not close enough to crowd him. Some grief wants silence more than touch. The auctioneer set up on the tailgate of a Land Rover Defender and began reading the lot in the flat, practiced voice of a man who has done this too many times already. 68 acres. Farmhouse. Outbuildings. Machinery listed. He read it as if naming the pieces could make the loss sound orderly. It could not. And then, at the back of the yard, a man stood by a gatepost in wraparound sunglasses and a wax jacket. He had clearly arrived without ceremony, and he was doing the one thing that makes people notice him later. Nothing. Not talking. Not introducing himself. Not asking to be seen. Just watching. If you know the sort of reputation the story attaches to him, that restraint alone is enough to make you suspicious. Understatement has never been his usual style. There is an unwritten rule at farm auctions like this one. You do not bid against a neighbor on his own front lawn while his family is standing there watching you do it. That rule does not need to be written down, because the punishment for breaking it is social and lasting. Rural England remembers. It remembers who behaved decently and who did not. It remembers who took advantage when someone was down. So when the auctioneer opened the bidding, the yard did what yards like that often do in hard moments. It looked at its booths. It stared into the middle distance. Nobody local raised a hand. Then a man in a sharp overcoat, standing near the front, made the first move. He was not a neighbor. He was not there on behalf of the community. He had driven up from London that morning for a firm that, according to the muttering that moved through the yard afterward, had been quietly buying up small Cotswold farms all year